So, welcome everyone. Welcome to Free Russia House. Thank you for coming and joining us today at Saturday. Happy to see so many people for such an important discussion on the Marshall's plan for Ukraine. My name is Gregory Frolov. I'm director in the Free Russia House in Kiev. I'm happy to see here such a high-profile experts. The actual co-author of the Marshall Plan for Ukraine, former Prime Minister of Lithuania, Andrius Kubilüs, Екатериной Смаглий, Director of Kennana Institute Kyiv office, and Olenay Trigub, Head of the Secretariat of the NACO Project with Transparency International Ukraine, and former Director for international programs with the Ministry of Economic Development of Ukraine. The topic we are discussing today is the Marshall's Plan, which is an incredibly important possible plan for a huge development aid for Ukraine from the number of European countries, which have been discussed on the high level for the last few months and presented at the Eastern Partnership Conference. I would then not, speak too much about it, since we are having Mr. Kubilüs at our stage today, who knows the best what it is, and I'm welcoming him for the remark about what this plan is and why it is the best way to help Ukraine right now.
Well, thanks a lot. Really, it's pleasure and honor to speak in such an audience. I never thought that I will speak so quickly, so rapidly when we started this initiative that I will speak about Marshall Plan for Ukraine in Free Russia House, or what you call it. Yeah, that's yeah. Because really, when I'm talking in some audiences back in Western community, especially in some think tanks and similar events, I'm using from time to time when I need to describe why we Lithuanians are doing this, I'm speaking about Free Russia. What is our goal at the end? At the end, our goal is really to assist Russia to become a free country, and the only way in which we see how we can assist Russia, it's very simple. It's to assist Ukraine at the moment. It's to assist Ukraine to become a successful country, sovereign, and so on and so on. So that's what is really the goal, the strategic goal of Marshall Plan. That is why we are using this terminology, which sometimes in different capitals, again in Europe, not everybody understands why we are calling it Marshall Plan when we are Europeans, and let's have some kind of European title. So in Berlin we agreed to name the plan, Merkel Plan. When we have been to Paris, we said that we can call it Macron Plan. But the philosophy really is of Marshall Plan. And here, being next to people from Kennana Institute, it's obvious, if you will read the history of Marshall Plan, you will see what important role Kennan played in the development of the plan. And the philosophy of Marshall Plan, again, was very geopolitical. Quite often in Ukraine, everybody's asking, when I'm starting to speak about Marshall Plan, everybody's asking, so when the money will come? When the money will come, Give us money immediately, we shall do everything. I'm saying, look guys, Marshall Plan is not only about money. It's about money in some way, but it's first of all about reforms. It's about reforms. And only in Ukraine I can explain using, Ostap Bender language. In Europe it's much more difficult. In here you understand very well. When I'm saying that, reforms are in the evening, should be done in the evening, then money will come in the morning. That's philosophy. Why we are so keen to speak about this instrument like money and reforms? Because when we started, to put all that plan, we started from some kind of non-paper which we called philosophy, philosophy non-paper, and we started from very simple question: No, and the question sounded like, how do you think? What is Putin's plan in Ukraine? And we gave a very simple answer. And our answer was, at least if I would be in Putin's place, which is nightmare scenario for myself, but I am trying to imagine what I would have as strategic goal, towards Ukraine. My goal would be not to allow Ukraine to become a successful country. Because success of Ukraine, one thing is, can endanger, Putin regime in Kremlin, because that can be an example to ordinary Russian people what can be achieved. Second, of course, is if Ukraine is becoming a successful country, then there is no possibility for Putin to expect what we even introduce new terminology, political terminology, dodonization. Dodon.
From Moldova.
Yeah, for Moldova. So Putin would not be able to expect dodonization of Ukraine. That is what can bring, what can be achieved by success of Ukraine. So when we answer to ourselves that Putin perhaps has a strategy not to allow Ukraine to become a successful country, we asked ourselves, so do we in the Western community, do we have a strategy how not to allow Putin to win with his strategy in Ukraine? And our answer was a little bit, ambivalent. Why? Because, again, from our own experience, I am in Lithuanian politics since 1988, from the very beginning, from our independence revolution. I was 2 times prime minister, so my luck was to be prime minister always during the crisis, But our own experience is very simple. When we're asking ourselves why we became quite successful country during those 27 years of independence, our answer is very, very pragmatic. Because from the very beginning, EU was offering us membership perspective. Back in the 90s, immediately after we got international recognition, we got association agreement in 1994. So it took us 3 years from independence recognition to go to association agreement. And even before association agreement, Western community was able to send us a message, first of all informal, then formalized, that if we shall make reforms, we shall be accepted as a members of EU. And that was keeping us on track with the reforms. That was the basis for our political consensus back in Lithuania. We call ourselves, in Lithuania that we are Italians of the North. There is very calm, and very pragmatic Estonians, and we are Catholics. We are very emotional, We are switching from one side to another side very quickly, So we were developing in such a way, so Italian way, from political point of view, from the left to the right, from then back, and so on. But because we had this consensus that we need to achieve, this, membership for ourselves, because Estonians will achieve, and what we shall do then, and so on. We cannot be, we need to be better than Estonians than them. So that was keeping us on track with all the reforms, and in some cases very painful reforms. For example, we were forced, or that was the EU position, to push us to close our nuclear power plant in Ignalina, which was of the same time like Chernobyl. We were trying to argue with them that, well, it's upgraded, it's modernized, it's very safe, but EU was very, very calm. If you don't want, it's your choice, Then Estonians will become members. We shall wait when you will agree on that decision. So that was painful, but we made it. So that's our experience. When we are looking into Ukraine, again, we're asking ourselves the question. Ukraine did, after Maidan revolution, quite a lot with all the reforms. Of course, still there are things which need to be done, anti-corruption and so on. But reforms were done. But EU did a lot also to support the reforms with association agreement, with free trade agreement, with visa-free agreement. But now it's a question, so what can become next for Ukraine, to become a basis for political and national consensus, to keep motivation for reforms on the same high level. Because at the end, unfortunately, that is a reality, sad reality, painful reality, but for time being, EU is not ready to give Ukraine membership perspective. So that was the reason why we said, okay, in that case, we need to look for, not for alternative, but for some kind in between of future membership in our perspective, which will come, but maybe it will take, 5 years or 10 years when EU will be ready, after all the Brexit and so on, to give such a perspective. But for time being, that it's very important to give this something like, again, new big carrot and stick for Ukraine, to move forward. And then one came with that idea, let's look then into more economical instrument. There were several good articles, first of all, by Natalia Resko, back in the winter of last winter, where she put very clear language. Ukrainian finances are stabilized at the end, with IMF loans, with EU assistance. Then the question is, so what Ukraine needs? What is the next challenge for Ukrainian economy to recover? Because the growth of economy still is around, 1.5 or 2%, it's too little, too limited. And the answer was that there is a shortage of investment, finances into real economy of Ukraine. And that if here would be something like around a 5 billion annual investment into real economy, like infrastructural projects, small and medium-sized business, then economic growth can reach up to 6 or 8%. We took that as a proper evaluation of the situation, and we said, okay, let's look for such a possibility. Then we, as I said, we put everything on paper. We started to travel through different capitals. We created a joint delegation with some members of Rada, like Hanna Hopko, who unfortunately was not able to join us today. And so the last few sentences, where we are now, we got European Parliament approval 2 weeks ago, perhaps 1 week before Eastern Partnership Summit. Exactly a resolution with recommendations towards Eastern Partnership Summit. It has exactly that language which we were looking for. That Commission and EIB should develop a special plan for investment into Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. Of course, they are avoiding to use this title of Marshall Plan, so now it's called European Plan for Ukraine. Yeah, I can give you one copy also. And in the summit declaration, there is a little bit more vague language, but we were not expecting anything from summit, because summit is too broad. You have Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, so you cannot expect very precise language specifically for Ukraine and for such an idea. But President Poroshenko spoke with Juncker and Hahn, Commissioner Hahn, and the message after the meeting was quite positive, that the EU is developing something like a roadmap for development and implementation of that plan. We had a meeting besides that also in the Commission, and again we got quite a good understanding. And also in Ukraine there is much better understanding what is needed to be done, because at the beginning, in both, especially in Commission and in some big capitals, there was not a skepticism, but again the question, the first most important question which we were getting, reminded me also the language of Ostap Bender. I don't know even how to translate, but this question in Russian language. Зачем тебе деньги, киса, если у тебя нет фантазии? So it's in Brussels you cannot explain in such a language, but the problem is exactly of such sort, because everywhere we were getting the same question. Why are you asking for Ukraine new money if Ukraine is not able to use the money which are allocated? So now we, at least in the government, we are working with Vice Prime Minister Kubiv, with finance ministry, with people from Prime Minister's office, with Danilo Bilak. They calculated. Now we have some kind of informal audit, still with some differences from Commission side and government, but government is saying that they got something like 6 billion euros since Maidan Revolution, which are allocated specifically for investment into real economy. Commission is calculated that there were something like 7 billion, so it's small margin, small difference, 1 billion euros. But government calculated that they managed to use only 1.6 billion to be invested into real projects. So now it's really the biggest problem is that there is a lack of what is called absorption capacity. There is a lack of what we call bankable projects. I mean projects ready for investment, which means that they need to have feasibility studies and everything else. At least during the last our trip, this lobbying trip or roadshow, we had in our team also Danilo Bilak from Invest Ukraine, agency. And he had very nice presentation, at least 10 projects which can be developed, but still can be developed, not developed up to that level. And those are the projects from infrastructure like Kherson seaport, railways, roads, and so on. So we are proposing in Ukraine to create a special agency which would take care about preparation of the projects, also about conditionality. We had very similar experience back in Lithuania. Somewhere around of year 2000, we started to understand that also we have problems with limited absorption capacity when the money started to come from different sources like EU and so on. So we created a special agency which has very complicated bureaucratic title, Central Project Management Agency, which did really good job in Lithuania. So we are proposing that experience for Ukraine. Things are moving, and that's where we are now. In a few days' time, we shall go to Washington DC again with the same team. Then we shall move to Ottawa, which again is very important, knowing Ukrainian diaspora, power in Canada, and also knowing that Canada from the beginning of next year will lead G7 group. So we think that this European plan for Ukraine can have another title like a global plan for Ukraine at the end, and that's what we're trying to do. So I hope that next year, 2018, will be really important year, that we shall see much more practicality in development of this project.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kubilüs, for your introduction.
It's your
copy
will be, yeah.
I will need to sign it, okay?
Okay.
For all of us.
Yeah, good.
As you mentioned, there are like a number of the problems regarding to the plan, which are all like ground-based and which are all around, availability of the projects to invest or willingness of the state structures to actually do reforms fast. As as European Union probably wants to invest money in Ukraine for reforms or not for something else. And so I'm skipping the part about Russia. Thank you for mentioning this. I would ask Elena for commenting on this, since this is probably a person with a great experience on knowing how the Western programs are being implemented in Ukraine and where the money goes. So, on your personal opinion, will this work? And what should be done to make this program work in a situation when we actually lacking like many things to do it fast?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you, Mr. Kubilüs, for the presentation of your plan. I think it's of course a beautiful idea, and from the political point of view and from logical point of view, of course, it's it's very good because otherwise, if Ukraine doesn't have this incentive to move forward, in Ukraine we see this internal political struggle happening, and we actually need something to stimulate Ukraine, to help to make this push. So politically, I'm, of course, on one page with you, but I'm a more technical person, of course. I worked as the head of the department, which was essentially the National Aid Coordination Unit in Ukraine. According to Ukrainian legislation, Ministry of Economy, and particularly the Minister of Economy, is the national coordinator for assistance from European Union, all modalities of assistance, macro-financial assistance, project support, technical assistance, loans, and the task of that department was essentially to do a similar thing to what you did in Lithuania with your agency, with your project management agency that pushed those projects forward, that made sure that they are implemented well and timely and effectively, and that there are low corruption risks. Essentially, I've been working on this issue for 2.5 years. And what I can tell you, what's the result of our attempts to create this capacity? It's not there as of now. And you talk to different political representatives of our government, like Mr. Kubilüs, like Vice Prime Minister Klimpuš-Cintsadze, like a person who is consulting us on investment, Danila Bilak. But the thing is, even though they all have this political support, they do not have, nowhere in our government, we don't have any institution, any unit, any agency who would make this political will into something feasible and actually help to use effectively assistance that we have received as of now. And my department, we developed many proposals, policy proposals, to create such an agency. We called it Development Cooperation Center Agency. There can be different ways to do it. You can either create it inside the government, or you can make like a separate agency. But unfortunately, not a single person in our government, including the Prime Minister himself, were interested in creating such an institution. In my opinion, such institution was needed already at the very early days after Maidan, because Ukraine received much more assistance than we received before. According to data that we have from the Organization of Economic Development, OECD, Economic Development and Cooperation in Europe. And this organization, for our audience, this is their basically international organization, which is based in Paris. And what they do, they measure, they monitor international assistance, official development assistance that goes from rich countries to countries that are developing and countries that are in transition, like our country. So according to them, our foreign assistance annual disbursement doubled after Maidan. If before we received around 700 million a year, after Maidan we started receiving 1.5 billion a year, and these are mostly grants. Because all very, very concessional loans where the grant element is over 25%. So the volume grew dramatically, but what the state did, they essentially, by the end of 2017, they already kind of completely destroyed their own institutional capacity to manage this money. Because my department was shut down. Part of the responsibilities for aid coordinations were transferred to Ministry of Finance, and they are supposed to coordinate loans from international financial institutions. We have huge problems with those loans because the rate of disbursement is very low, very slow, and it's very bad for Ukraine because we have right now in commitments around $8 billion from different IFIs like World Bank, EIB, EBRD, KfW, and this money is basically stuck. It's not moving, and it's on paper. And they were supposed, Ministry of Finance, they were supposed to create an office and hire people who would help to push those loans, who would make sure that they are happening. But they didn't do it. So essentially, this is the problem which I wanted to point out, that behind political will, there should be also an action. And if they want to get a Marshall Plan or European plan, first they need to show to the world they can effectively use the money which is already provided to them. And regarding the numbers, just to conclude, regarding the numbers, according to our aid coordination unit, if we talk about commitment, it's 3.6 billion in grants and 8 billion in loans. And actually, we created a website, a portal for the transparency of this assistance, which is called OpenAid.gov.ua, where we put all these programs online, where everybody, every citizen of Ukraine can go and see what are those programs, how this money is used. And if you go, you will understand that most grants are basically used mostly for technical assistance. There is not much of investment component there. And in my opinion, of course it's not good, because technical assistance is a very costly way to provide development aid, because you spend a lot of money on consultants, and sometimes as a result of this, you don't even have an output, and you don't have an impact, and you just essentially waste the resource. Whereas if you do something more physical, when you invest in physical infrastructure, make capital investment, at least you have something that stays and serves the people. So you ask, why then international donors do not invest in some ports, in roads, in some feasible things that you can touch? This is because Ukraine has very low project management capacity. And if you, from position of international donor, if I was, for example, like sent here from Brussels to spend, for example, 9 million euro, for me it's much lower risk to spend it on different seminars and trainings and consultants, because at least I will have proper reporting. I will know that I will hire 7 consultants, and they will spend their salaries, and they will work, and it will be fine. But if I risk to do something more tangible, this project can get me in trouble, because in Ukraine, I will have to deal with the issue of using land, with all these things that are, complicated bureaucracy, which make all these tasks very difficult in Ukraine. If I want to repair school, it can go really wrong. Even if I want to build even something bigger, it can go really, really wrong, because my money can be stuck or stolen, or things can be done but not in the right way, and then the risk is generally high. This is why we are still stuck in this situation when international donors want to help Ukraine, but they choose the easiest way. They choose technical assistance. And this is not also working well for us, because Ukraine itself at least should tell donors what it needs in terms of which reforms are priorities, where to invest this money. But Ukraine lacks capacity even to say that, even to coordinate assistance, even to express its priorities. Assistance should be demand-driven, but Ukraine doesn't have capacity even to form this demand. And therefore, in my opinion, I talked before, my conclusion about what Ukrainian government should do, that they should show the donors. But then to the donors, I would say what they should do. They should simply go and help Ukraine to build this institutional capacity to coordinate its own assistance. It's great that support group for Ukraine was created to deal with this issue, to coordinate assistance from EU. But why they didn't think about actually building internal capacity, not like a parallel structure, but building something which will stay in Ukraine and which will work in Ukraine? I think it's a long process. It's not done overnight. First you implement some flagship project, you're sure you can do it, then you get more money to do other projects. But if we talk about Ukraine never received money from the compact program of Millennium Challenge Corporation, for example. This is infrastructure project, like in Georgia, they were building roads, hospitals. In Moldova, they were building roads. How much money Ukraine received to build something in investment field from them? Zero. Ukraine only received money from them for technical assistance, and then they stopped precisely because of this problem that Ukraine doesn't have capacity, and it needs to be developed. This is my last message again. I repeat it that Ukraine should focus on developing this capacity. Politicians should step forward and do it, and donors should help them do it. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Alena. I just want to follow up on this with Mr. Kubilüs. As it was mentioned a number of times, the problem is with management of those money inside Ukraine. And I just want to ask how the authors of Marshall Plan would like to deal with it, since, as I know, Israel in plan to create some structure inside Ukraine with a number of independent from the state structure, which are gonna work on selection of the projects and working with the local stuff. And so how will it work? Who gonna be on decision making, and how this fits with the current situation?
Well, exactly. I think that you have spoken exactly what we are speaking about, But also we are trying not only to speak, but also to assist Ukraine. So at the end of January, we are organizing some kind of informal seminar back in Vilnius, where we shall try to show to to the people of Ukrainian government, those with whom we are discussing, like from people from the Ministry of Finance, Invest Agency, from Ministry of Economy, and so on, and also people from Commission and European Investment Bank, and the EBRD people. So we're trying to organize such an informal seminar where we shall show how our agency was established, and what it started to do, and what it's still till now it's doing. So that's very practical. With really pushing Ukrainian government to move forward into that direction. I see all the possibilities that they will do it. Then the question is who will be stakeholders of that agency. We are speaking in a very clear way that it should be established not only by the government of Ukraine, but with participation of major donors, in order really to bring trust of that agency both inside of Ukraine and outside of Ukraine on a high level. So that's our idea. Then of course that is what we are speaking in our plan. If you look into other countries, but that is not our experience. But for example, Poland, yes, historically it was established during even Pilsudski time. And a lot of countries in Europe have so-called development banks or financial development institutions. In Germany, using Marshall Plan, they established this Cafe W. Yeah, that's which is still operating like a development bank. So in Lithuania, we started to look into also such a possible development that we. Maybe using that experience and capacities which we have in our project management agency, we shall upgrade it up to development bank. That's as you can see from other countries, it's really very practical, even not at that moment like Ukraine is now, when you need to move forward. But for example, while we were investigating what upgrading our understanding what is needed to be done in Ukraine. I learned even why Poland became so successful with the reconstruction of roads. And it appears that their development bank he has special, mandate to demand good bankable projects from road agency. And then they have very good trust with European Investment Bank. And each year they are getting something like around of 6 billion euros, which they are spending on the reconstruction of the roads. And suddenly the roads, which 15 years ago we were very proud, that our roads are much better than Polish roads, suddenly we see that perhaps we're starting to lose in that competition. So that's one thing. Second, of course, which I maybe more psychological, more political. You absolutely correctly, mentioned that what is a problem in Ukraine, that sometimes it looks like that you have no patience, which is pretty natural, but you need to understand that really some of the reforms, some of the institutions, you cannot create them during one night. I remember well, my feeling. I was much younger, back in 1990s, after our revolution. I was dreaming that in 1 year time we shall start to live like they are living in Sweden. And I asked one very famous professor, during one economical professor, liberal, our ambassador knows very well, Edward Vilkas. Unfortunately, he died several years ago, but very prominent, with very good sense of humor and language. I put a question, so when we shall live like they are living in Sweden? And he explained in a very simple way. 2 years after that moment when we shall start to walk like they are walking in Sweden. That was an explanation. And still we are not living like they are living in Sweden, so still we need to develop both our institutions and our productivity and so on and so on. So for a lot of things there is simply there is a need of time, there is a need of experience, maturity of political institutions and so on and so on. But it should not put you to such a white or black, how to say, understanding. If some things are still not in a good way, done in Ukraine, doesn't mean that Ukraine has no perspective at all. So even if you do not have, for time being, this agency for project management, you should not, criticize yourself to the death. It should be done. It will be done. Ukraine will learn how to use the money, and when Ukraine will be able to show that they really are using those money which are allocated to Ukraine for time being, there will be new money from the donors coming in.
So just a short question: how many years the Marshall Plan will need for implementation, so the regular Ukrainians, ordinary Ukrainians, will actually feel that the plan is working?
Well, it's a good question. I do not have a very clear answer. I have the answer that the plan should be operational as quickly as possible. That's for sure. And Ukrainian people should see as quickly as possible that really, first of all, Western community is here together with them, together with Ukrainians, and also that there are clear and very practical economical developments in Ukraine, like new roads, new bridges, higher growth of economy, new jobs, new better salaries, and so on. So that is very much needed. And again, if you look into original Marshall Plan, why George Marshall started the plan back in 1947? Because he became afraid, being at that time state secretary and former very famous general. He became afraid that Stalin will try to expand its political influence into the Western European countries like France, Italy, Greece, which were suffering of weak economy after the Second World War. And he was afraid in a very simple, he was afraid that local communists, which were of course, influenced or regulated from Moscow, that they will be able to win elections because people dissatisfaction with a bad economical situation in France and in other countries will push them to vote for those communists. So they managed to start the plan very quickly back in 1948, and they managed with the plan to avoid communists winning elections, and in such a way they stopped put in plan to expand his political domination into those countries. The same is needed to be done here in Ukraine, because all the hybrid wars have very clear goal to get back political domination in Ukraine by Kremlin. That's very clear. How to avoid it? Again, let's look into Marshall Plan experience and George Kennan. Besides that, George Kennan, yeah. And for how long? I cannot answer. Well, we are putting like 10 years and $5 billion each year, but I think that if it will start be implemented, and if there will be clear successful projects showing that really absorption capacities here, projects are developed, I think that we shall see much more of private foreign investment coming into Ukraine and really investing into good projects, because first of all, Ukraine has very huge potential of economical growth, and I think that first steps, successful steps in showing that really it's manageable, it's working, will open gates for foreign investment, and then we shall see if still some kind of Marshall Plan money are needed or not.
Okay, thank you so much for this comment, and then let's actually discuss and ask for some intro into what the original Marshall Plan was.
What George Kennan should do now in Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Grigory. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. Actually, when I was on my way to the Free Russia House, I was a little bit concerned that we won't have an audience because the weather is atrocious today. So thank you very much for making the effort and joining us. Again, let me thank our Lithuanian colleagues for initiating the Marshall Plan, which is, as had already been mentioned, is a wonderful idea. And of course, Ukraine should be proud and should feel itself really honored to have such committed friends in Europe who kind of support us in every possible way, travel to many European and international capitals to really advocate on Ukraine's behalf for the financial assistance that is much needed and for the reform assistance that is also very much needed. However, I would like to, after all these positive introductions, I would like to suggest that we all think a little bit more critically, and question the premises upon which the Marshall Plan idea as of today for Ukraine is being presented, and think what else can be probably provided for Ukraine, how to really, if we need a Marshall Plan, then what kind of a Marshall Plan we need to make this country prosper. Since Grigory asked me to give you a little bit of a historical introduction, let me just to remind you that the Marshall Plan was indeed initiated by George Marshall, who was at that time State Secretary, and he launched the idea in 1948, and the Marshall Plan lasted only for 3 years. Those critics in the EU who say that the historical parallels are simply wrong would say that indeed after the Second World War, when the Marshall Plan was initiated, the devastation caused by the Second World War was incomparable to the devastation that Ukraine faces nowadays as a result of the Russian aggression in Donbass. To remind you about the numbers, we had 55 million people dead. We had 100 million people who became disabled as a result of, or had different sorts of disabilities as a result of the war. And the financial losses caused by the Second World War were approximately $900 billion in the money as we know today. So this is already kind of exchanged to dollars. In Germany alone, 40% of housing has been destroyed completely. Prices grew, almost doubled in the UK, and in the United Kingdom until 1951. Food was sold based on coupons, as in Ukraine, if you remember when the Soviet Union collapsed, we had these food coupons that we exchanged in addition to the money that we paid. In Germany, we had 12 million internally displaced people who moved to different parts around the world. We had a lot of problems, as you remember, with the Jewish population. Of course, so this level of poverty that Europe witnessed and Germany witnessed was simply incomparable to what we have right now. There are documented facts of Germans eating from rubbish bins which were placed next to поселения американских солдат, the places where American soldiers had been located. So because American army had received food and supplies from the United States, their rubbish bins were probably much more filled, than rubbish bins elsewhere. So the homeless had been eating next to the American army settlements. Again, the critics who say that the Marshall Plan for Ukraine is a wrong idea would also bring you the ideological motive that has been just discussed. We have the Putin threat, we have the disinformation campaign, we have the hybrid war. So we need to do something to stop Putin's disinformation and to really make Ukraine a success story, which would demonstrate that the democratic revolutions is something to aspire. Indeed, it is true that in Europe, communists have been on the rise. In Greece, in France, in Italy, communists were the most popular political force after the Second World War. And that is why the only way to encourage people vote for alternative parties, for parties that had more liberal views, was to bring economic welfare, to bring economic wealth to the population, to encourage them to vote for alternative forces. And it is true, again, I'm very pleased that the founder of our institute, George Kennan, who at that time served at the embassy in Moscow in 1946, he wrote his famous long telegram where he first listed the containment policy, which later was very much appropriated by the US State Department and which was used broadly by the President Truman. The year later, George Kennan became the first director of the Policy Planning Directorate, which is like an internal think tank within the State Department. And he was the one who actually stood behind the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the IMF, the World Bank, and even the EU, because the Policy Planning Department was providing a vision, of how the United States and Europe should support each other and be mutually beneficial to really stop Russia and stop Stalin from moving very aggressively towards not only the Eastern Europe, which he acquired after the Yalta Agreement, but also further to acquire even hearts and minds of Western Europeans. But today, as we know well, Russia is incomparably weaker, and incomparably weaker to the Soviet Union. It has a poor economy. We have another economic element, which is the sanctions, which are already biting, and we see that Russian economy is going down as a result of the sanctions. And basically, this ideological moment is also not that strong because Ukraine has a vibrant political environment. We don't have communists in power. We have a multi-party system, and we have a democratic environment where different political parties can compete and can get votes from the population. If the programs that they suggest, if the programs that they advocate for are well received and supported by the electorate. So the strongest skepticism, which I personally heard from a number of European politicians, is that on the eve of the parliamentary and on the eve of the presidential elections, which are coming very closely, these funds, which Ukraine may eventually receive from the Marshall Plan, or if we call it the European Plan for Ukraine, will not be used for the benefit of ordinary Ukrainians and for the benefit of Ukraine as a state. That it will simply be used as a political element of, again, political support from the EU by the incumbent president, Poroshenko, and the political force and politicians who stand behind him, and will simply help him win the next presidential elections and his political force to help them win the parliamentary elections. This by itself may create not a level playing field, for other political forces who would participate in elections, because it is clear that the party in power will use it, as they already use the visa liberalization regime, which Ukraine had been working very hardly for the last 25 years, and it's not only the result of the Poroshenko's government, the visa liberalization regime that Ukraine received, but also the Yanukovych government worked on visa liberalization, the Yushchenko's government worked on visa, and Kuchma worked on visa. So, we need to be smart and think, how one political force can use this support from the EU simply for its own political benefit, simply to boost their own political popularity. Finally, the fourth criticism that I've heard is that Ukraine is not a poor state as such. The electronic declarations that had been recently revealed, and Ukrainians have the chance to kind of look at those electronic declarations. They show that the political class of this country has accumulated extreme financial and economic wealth. Just to give you 4 names of the top 3, people who in this country who declared the highest wealth is on number 3 is Alexander Tretiakov, member of the Petro Poroshenko's bloc, who declared almost $4 million. Then the second place is shared by brothers Bogdan and Yaroslav Dubnevici, also members of Petro Poroshenko bloc by coincidence. Now they currently have almost $20 million. And the number 1 is President Poroshenko himself, who in 2015 has declared $26 million. And his assets, as we know, and his financial assets grow faster in this country than assets of any other politician or any other businessman. So what to do in this situation? And I don't even want to touch the issue of the lack of absorption capacity, which Elena has described so clearly. So for those politicians and our European colleagues who travel to Washington, Ottawa, Brussels, and who really advocate for Ukraine and say that, look, that's what Ukraine needs nowadays. Ukraine needs a European plan for Ukraine. I'm confident, and probably you've seen a lot of skepticism yourself, people who would say, but really reforms don't move forward. We already provided substantial assistance, and I haven't mentioned that why Marshall Plan was so important after the Second World War, because IMF and the World Bank, as you know, they've been just established. The procedures have not yet been in place, and the first financial disbursements that IMF and the World Bank started giving, they came after the Marshall Plan. So the United States really needed to provide financial support quickly. In our situation, Ukraine is eligible to receive IMF loans. In our situation, as you know, Ukraine has already received in the last years alone from the United States aid for $1.3 billion. This is almost half of what Ukraine has received over the last 25 years. Ukraine has just lost, as you know very well, 600 million euro from the European Union because Europe is dissatisfied with the level of reforms, and in 4 points we had simply missed the opportunity to deliver on the promise of reforms. So if we consider all these factors together, the missing historical parallels, the missing ideological threat, availability of other institutions where Ukraine can receive financial aid, and the creation of uneven political plain level field for politicians who may simply use this to boost their own popularity, we may think that probably the Marshall Plan is not the most effective mechanism to support Ukraine at the moment and to ensure that Ukraine will be the viable country in the future. Over the last months, we held 4 civil society forums in Kiev and in many other places. And just yesterday, the reanimation package of reform, probably some of you were there, at the Ukraine House held a big forum where one of the participants cited the results of a very interesting opinion poll which had been held among the leaders of Ukraine's NGOs. When asked what kind of assistance do you think Ukraine needs to succeed, the 3 most frequently mentioned answers were environmental reforms, cultural reforms, and support of small and medium-sized businesses. As you know, Ukraine's small and medium-sized businesses make their role in Ukraine's GDP is only 10%. In the EU member states, small and medium-sized businesses are responsible for from 60 to 80% of their country's GDPs. So maybe instead of reconstructing roads, instead of kind of investing into new sewage systems somewhere where the money can simply be misappropriated and simply stolen, what EU, if EU really needs to support Ukraine and wants to support Ukraine, I believe EU should start a vigorous support of Ukraine's humanitarian field, Ukraine's education and Ukraine's culture. The visa liberalization regime all of a sudden had one negative side effect on Ukrainians. As you know, as a result of visa liberalization, we just lost 2 million Ukrainians who got legitimate legal grounds to move to Poland and work there. So we have 2 million Ukrainians working in Poland, supporting Polish economy, instead of coming back to Ukraine and supporting and working for Ukraine's economy. These people can only stay in country if they will know that there are places for them to work, and these places can be created by better conditions and better economic conditions for small and medium-sized enterprises. And for this we need universities, for this we need strong cultural institutions, and probably that's where the support of our European partners can be much stronger. The last point that I'd like to make is the role played currently by EU Ambassador Hugh Mingarelli, who I believe is one of the strongest EU ambassadors that this country had ever had. In a private communication with me, Mr. Mingarelli mentioned that before coming to Ukraine, for example, he served in Morocco. And he said, do you know that in Morocco, EU spends every year almost 7 million euros to give grants to organizations that support Moroccan culture. Do you know how much EU spends on supporting Ukraine's culture? 0. So it was not before Mingarelli came to Ukraine that the European Union launched, together with British Council, the new call for proposals. Probably some of you have seen it, with the total budget of 1.4 million euro. But this is Ukraine with almost 45 million people, at least officially. And this is a small Morocco. So Ukraine has 1 million, Morocco has 7 million. This again demonstrates the disproportion that we have. Here I will probably stop and let our people and our guests probably to have more interactive discussion.
I think I just should give us the authority to follow up on this. I mean, Katya, to be honest, I always want to discuss many of these points with you too, because I'm not agree on many of them. But I'm gonna provide the word for Mr. Kubilüs. And so the thing out of these points, which on my taste was the most important to mention and discuss, is the first, how the transparency and reporting system will work with the Marshall Plan, and how, if it's going to be accessible for the local NGOs and for the civil society in Ukraine, which is amazingly strong in this country. And secondary, will the Marshall Plan provide a possibility for smaller and medium-sized businesses to get some money for development? And also, will it be possible for Marshall Plan to work with universities? So maybe like on different kind of projects. I'm not just sure how it is written into the plan right now.
No, very good questions. Of course, I cannot answer immediately to all of them because it sounds a little bit like when the money will come, and
Yeah.
still we are on that stage that we need to convince donors to spend money for Ukraine. So some technical questions I cannot answer, but really very important is that money will be spent not only on infrastructural projects, but also on small and medium-sized business. That's for sure. That is what we are speaking about. I agree with education, culture, and so on. My wife, she's playing in National Symphony Orchestra, violin, so culture for me is very important. But I don't know, how Europe will do it. But it's okay. But I would say also, I spent my recent vacation here in Ukraine, on a bicycle tour from Mariupol down to Berdiansk and then up to Kramatorsk. And I would say, if I would be responsible for where money should be spent, I would spend on the roads. On the roads. That's, why. We know why. Because, again, of course, for people it's very much needed, culture and education. But when you are living in the surrounding where the roads are totally bad and so on, and you do not see the progress in such a very simple, simple conditions of the life, of course, then you are deciding that there is no hope to stay in Ukraine, and you are, going to Poland or Lithuania or some other country. So that's one thing. Second is Marshall Plan 1947, Marshall Plan now. A lot of different conditions. I don't know if Russia really is weaker than it was back in 1947. That's a separate discussion. On a hybrid, influences, I don't think that it's weaker. And let's be, more careful about such conclusions. I am not so sure if Western community is so strong as it was back in 1947. Unfortunately, I do not see, Truman, I do not see Marshall, I do not see Kennan, I do not see, Harriman, and I can name. That's a problem again. Adenauer even. Okay, Merkel maybe, but okay, that's again a different topic to discuss. Where Western community is now, if you compare with 1947. So that's why I would not be so quick in saying that conditions now are totally different, and let's forget about Marshall Plan. Last argument for Marshall Plan for Ukraine in such a discussion is very simple. Recently, Commission announced Marshall Plan for Western Balkans. Why? Reason is very simple. Because if you look into different political documents, even open political documents, there is a very simple conclusion. If Western world is not moving into Western Balkans, then Russia will move. And Russia is moving into that area and destabilizing and so on and so on. That is why Western community is really speeding up, both negotiations on membership of Western Balkans and also with Marshall Plan. 13 billion up to 2020. It's big amount of money if you compare, Ukraine and Western Balkans, what EU is now ready to spend on Western Balkans, if to compare with our still theoretical plan. That's for sure. And that is why speaking in Brussels, I'm always saying you are doing very good policy towards Western Balkans. You are giving them membership perspective and you are giving them Marshall Plan. There is no membership perspective for Ukraine. Let's give at least Marshall Plan. That's my very simple logic. And the last point on that Poroshenko will use all that Marshall Plan for his forthcoming elections. Very valid question, but it reminds me a little bit of my experience in Ukraine back in May, perhaps in 2013, when we came here with several of my colleagues with very, I would say, secret mission to convince at that time, Klitschko, Poroshenko including, Yatsenyuk, who was leading the party when Yulia was in prison, and several others, to convince them to support the goal of signing association agreement by Yanukovych during Vilnius summit, because they were ready to oppose, because if that will be signed, then Yanukovych will have a benefit of signing agreement, and that will be very bad. That was well, I'm telling you what real facts. We spent 3 days, speaking with all of them. I saw at least 5 future presidents, at least. They were speaking like future presidents. At that time, we were very happy to convince them that really it would be a big mistake. And when we left, for airport, we saw that they signed a joint statement and so on and so on. So this is exactly what I see now when you are saying that, well, Marshall Plan, maybe it's a bad initiative because government of today or president of today will use that opportunity. I think that Ukraine is really needs of such a plan, despite who is in power. And what I would do if I would be in opposition now, towards, let's say, president or government, I would criticize president and government that they still do not have Marshall Plan in place. That they are not implementing it in an effective way. So, it's why really we need to be concerned from different point of view when we're speaking about elections. Always in political life you are using, if you have an opportunity and you achieve a good goal, you are saying I am the best, president or best prime minister, vote for me. But the problem with elections in such countries like Ukraine, as Lithuania was back in 1990s, is a totally different problem. I would call it, I don't know how much you know, but I am calling it Iron Law of Samuel Huntington. Samuel Huntington, very famous American political writer, political philosopher, late. He died several years ago. He was very famous writing his book about clashes of civilizations. But also he wrote several books on how the young democracies, after revolutions, how they are developing. And when I read one of his books, I thought that he was writing it about Lithuania, because exactly, he wrote, from theoretical point of view, how the first 4 elections are happening. And he based his analysis on his understanding how public opinion is changing in a young democracy. Like, after revolution there is a lot of enthusiasm and people are voting for revolutionary parties, like they did after Maidan recently, and as they did back in 1990 for us. They voted for our party because we brought independence. Then all that enthusiasm very rapidly disappears, and according to Huntington, second elections are based on nostalgia vote. It was exactly in Lithuania when it was shock for us. In 1992, people voted for former Communist Party. So for whom they will vote in second elections here, I don't know. But I think that Putin is expecting that they will vote exactly according to this, Huntington law. Luckily, Huntington predicted that the third elections will be, won by revolutionists again. We won in 1996. But that's what is happening in such post-revolutionary situation, and that is what we need to be very much worried about. It's not like Poroshenko will use Marshall Plan, for his benefit. The question is really who is going to win elections with a better program for reforms, European type reforms, which are needed, for Ukraine very much.
Okay, thank you. Elena, okay, just 1 minute, okay?
Yeah, just 1 minute.
Just 1 minute.
Like, since now I work for Transparency International, my point is that how we make sure that the regime, the political class which is ruling Ukraine today is not using it for own cause. We introduced very strong anti-corruption reform conditionality. What the ruling class is afraid of is the successful anti-corruption reform, because if we build an ecosystem of successful agency for corruption prevention, NABU, SAP, anti-corruption court, then there will be a very dangerous situation for them, because many of their stakeholders in this system of power will be then under threat. They will not be able to illegally fund the parties. They will not be able to do all these corrupt deals that they are doing. And that's why it's very important to stress this, that this plan comes with anti-corruption reform. After Maidan, there was an attempt by EU to create a joint investigative body, EU-Ukraine, investigative body where Europeans would come and work together with Ukrainians in case money is missing from some EU projects, and they would have legal powers for criminal investigation in Ukraine. It was a very bold plan, and it was rejected, but I think it was a mistake. Because you didn't mention this, Mr. Kubilüs, but probably when you go lobby for this plan, you also asked what if money is stolen, right? Many times maybe, and
Sure.
that's why I am completely for Marshall Plan, but with anti-corruption conditionality.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Questions are.
Good afternoon. My name is Victoria, and I'm working as a journalist. So actually, I'm really interested in today's topic. And this week we just came back from Brussels, and we actually met the representatives of Federica Smaglir cabinet and Mr. Han's cabinet. And what we just heard, actually, we heard that Ukraine has got an unprecedented support for the last 3 years. And if we're talking about the money, it was even, we heard about more numbers, not even 7 billions, but even more than 10. And we heard that, we asked them about, maybe you heard about so-called Marshall Plan for Ukraine, and they answered that what Ukraine has got for this moment is already what they can propose at this level. So my question would be, how do you plan to involve European Union more in the realization of Marshall Plan in Ukraine, and how do you think they are really ready for this today? Because again, what we heard is not really positive. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me maybe ask a few more questions
Yeah, sure,
and
sure,
then
sure.
just answer them straight.
Yeah.
Here, a colleague from Kyiv Mohyla Academy.
Valentin Yakushik, political scientist from Kyiv Mohyla Academy. I would like to ask Mr. Prime Minister, does the West understand the urgency of the plan which you propose? Because we have a little bit similar situation to what Katerina explained about the 1947 when they were communists. But now we have very powerful right-wing, aggressive right-wing, who are including in the army, in the police. Does the West pay attention to this? That you would rather support the ruling cartel alliance political party, then you may avoid this destabilization of the country by the right wing. And another aspect, another important aspect, who may be the main actor in providing funds for Marshall Plan? Maybe if the West is not ready, there are alternatives. Some royal families in the Middle East and China. But for that, Ukraine will need to think about adaptation of its own policy, to have not one direction, but again, come back to a balanced, multi-vector, what was proposed, I think, by Henry Kissinger.
Well, okay, you manage it. Yeah.
Okay, the one more question.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for such an interesting, insight in the Marshall Plan. Because I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Daria. I work at the Parliament of Ukraine. So, because for Ukrainians, it's sometimes hard to understand what it's all about. We hear so many speeches about how much money European Union and foreign funds invested into Ukraine, and they all get, someone got bribed, they got stolen, and so on and so forth. And of course, I mean, investing into Ukrainian economy as well as investing into some humanitarian programs, it has an extreme importance because, of course, it's not comparable, the damage that is caused by the aggression of Russia in Ukraine right now to the damage that was caused by the Second World War in Germany, but still, we have almost 2 million IDPs here, ruined schools. I mean, the whole region is just in ruins. And what I'm actually really anxious about and what really disturbs me is that, as Olena correctly said, the Ukrainian project management capacities are really limited. So sometimes, even if some foreign initiatives want to invest into rebuilding schools or building roads or into small and middle businesses, it all gets stuck on the level of Ukrainian bureaucracy. And from my point of view, it's hard for me to understand what has to be done on political level to, let this money work for Ukrainian people and not only for like political purposes of the Poroshenko party and so on. Thank you.
Well, yeah, it's it's a question how to answer all the questions in a very short way. Yeah.
You can mix.
Yeah, I will try to. I will answer in a very simple way. How I see the challenge for Ukraine is really to continue with European type reforms. That's my answer for multi-polarity or something like that. It would be my guess. It would be a big mistake for Ukraine to lose very clear direction. European type reforms. I'm not saying that Europe is, the best. It's heaven and so on and so on, but it lives on a very clear values and very clear regulations. I know that in Ukraine always, because Ukraine is a large country, is a rich country, is very important country, and in Ukraine always there is a temptation, which we luckily avoided. Temptation to think about so-called third way. We shall not go with Moscow, but Brussels or Washington is not, accepting us immediately, so we shall try to find our own way, either with China, with Arabs, or so on and so on. Which is, what does it mean? It means that you are losing this clear direction, European type, of legislation, and so on and so on. And when you are losing that direction, it's very good again for those big oligarchs. Then they will create local type of regulation, which they need, and which perhaps will not be very much, in the line of so-called Western, or European type regulation. Second, of course, then the question is how to make reforms really to be implemented as fast as possible. And that is my answer to Victoria, that EU is not very much positive, or at least some bureaucrats in EU are not very much positive. And also, we hear that that EU gave so much of assistance, and there is no need of anything else. Simply, Ukraine would go with the reforms, and that's all. It's a very nice, proposal, but which has very limited political understanding of how politics is working in reality, and not only in Ukraine, but everywhere. When the reforms are done, when there is clear carrot and clear stick. That's our experience, that's an experience of Ukraine, that is experience of all the countries which were moving with such an agenda of reforms. You cannot expect politicians to become suddenly, ideal, human beings of reform performance and so on, if there is no clear of that mechanism of carrot and stick. For us, carrot was very big back in Lithuania in 1990. Membership. Membership was big carrot, and stick. We accepted all the punishments very quickly. So now the question is very simple. That is what we are speaking in Europe. What is next carrot? After association agreement, after free trade, and after visa free, and there is no answer. That is why in European Parliament, where politicians are present from all the different countries, we got much better understanding than we were getting in bureaucratic corridors. Now I'm saying that after European Parliament voted for resolution with clear language on this plan, I am putting a very rhetoric question. That is a test to see if Europe is a democratic country. When Parliament is voting in favor, we shall see if bureaucracy is really moving along those lines. But I am more positive about bureaucracy. I think that really we are on a good track in understanding on both sides, both in Brussels and in Kiev, what is needed to be done. And I am absolutely hopeful that it will be achieved. From political science, right wing is also dangerous always, like left wing or anything else, or like Russian influences. And sometimes we know from our own experiences, that Russia is very good in pushing some radical, right wing agenda. Like in Lithuania, still we are lucky that we are not suffering of all that Euroscepticism. But when we see somebody starting to speak very much about how bad is Europe, with all gay Europe and so on, that language, then you can ask yourself how much of Russian influence are in all those statements. So in general, that's my point. Really, we need to work very heavily in Europe in trying to convince them to see Ukraine like a very, very important strategic issue, strategic challenge, where really it would be very, very bad and very wrong if Europe will decide that, well, first of all, Ukraine needs to improve itself, to bring clear and clean democracy, and to develop it on their own back home here in Ukraine, and then maybe Europe will come. That will not work, because again, for Putin, it's much more easy. Just wait. Don't allow Ukraine, to move forward with implementation of successful reforms, and wait when democracy will bring dodonization, happening also in Ukraine. That's what we need to avoid.
Okay, thank you. So I guess we are having maybe 4 minutes more. So I'm just gonna give for last remarks for every speaker, and then.
Thank you. In my remarks, I would like also to address the questions that we were asked. I think if we talk about countries like China, China is already Ukraine's donor. I was the one also coordinating Chinese assistance, but exactly like Mr. Kubilüs said, we do not need to put just money on the problem and think Ukraine will prosper. We need reform. And I would say not even reform, but transformation. And Poland is a rich country today, not because Poland received a lot of assistance from the West, but because Poland transformed itself. And this also has to do with other things that we discussed here, and what Katarina was saying about how we can help some concrete issues in Ukraine, like small, medium businesses. How can EU or foreign donors help them? Would they give them some concessional loans to start businesses? Would they give them some seed grants to start businesses? Would they arrange some seminars where they teach them how to become small, medium businesses? They can do all of that. But if you are in Ukrainian environment, you would say, no, I don't want to take the money. I don't want to take the risk, because if I become rich, I know there will be some corrupt officials who will come to me and extort my business, or there are no proper courts in Ukraine. If my partner in business will steal my money, I will not be even able to protect myself financially. So people are not willing to start this business because they are afraid of risks. And we come here to the issue of reform and transformation. After Maidan, we were talking about deregulation, about creating better business climate. I was myself responsible for creating better delivery regulation office. It's around 9 million euro project where we assembled lawyers who are redrafting all Ukrainian legislation in order to create better regulations to work here. And these regulations would influence not only businesses but also projects, because it's the same issue, how long it takes you to get this permit or that permit. But as a result of all this activity, what is our place in doing business ranking? We're basically stuck in one place. We move 1 point up. We're still like 79, 80. So we're not talking about like huge leap. And this leap should happen only if there is a strong political will, if there is strong push for transformation. And that's why, to conclude, I would say that assistance is effective if it comes in a very comprehensive package, I would say. It's called, sometimes technically they call it sector-wide approaches. It's when you want to help, for example, as a foreign donor, you want to help Ukraine have better small, medium businesses. Then what I would do, I would give Ukraine a big loan where I would put conditionalities to introduce this law. I would also give Ukraine money for projects. I would also give small grants for businesses. And this way you create change from above, and you also stimulate some movement from below. But things, if they are not comprehensive, if things are not happening in tune with each other, then nothing, will work. And this is the answer. I think that there should be political will, and somehow foreign donors should think about how to stimulate this political will. And this is what we're talking about here, about Marshall, this carrot thing. And then there should be this assistance happening on the ground. And that's basically the conclusion I would make.
Thank you, Elena. Katja, just 1 minute.
My personal concern with the Marshall Plan is that it provides too big a carrot with too little a stick, and we need to make sure that this is balanced. The lady who asked the last question, she raised a very important question about IDPs. You mentioned that right now we have 1.6 million IDPs in Ukraine. And just recently, the Atlantic Council had a conference. We presented results with analysis, whether or not Ukraine's government is the driving force to support IDPs. And the conclusions were basically negative, because the driving force in support of Ukraine's IDPs is civil society and volunteers. And we discussed the education field, the displaced universities, which are managed nowadays by only one person at the Education and Science Ministry, and basically this government abandoning these displaced universities altogether. This explains, in my opinion, very, very well, that we have to separate the war in the East and how this conflict has to be resolved, and how the negative economic consequences of the war in the East have to be supported by the EU funding and international funding, and what this government that controls Ukraine's territory, what kind of homework it has to do for itself to make sure, that the territory which is under Ukraine's control is properly managed, that is free of corruption, and that has strong political parties that really represent the will of the people. These are two absolutely separate questions, and we don't have to mix them up. The Marshall Plan was an extremely important historical precedent. It is a brand, and that is why this brand is so well used, so useful to correspond to the current Ukraine situation. But the plan that Ukraine needs nowadays is not the Marshall Plan. It has to be the Ukraine plan, the plan that has to be designed by its own leaders, by its own politicians. They have to present something on the table and to demonstrate to the entire world and to Ukrainians that's what we want to do. And if you still believe in us, please support us, and we will deliver together. Unfortunately, right now the wagon stands before the horse, where the horse is Ukraine's leadership and the wagon is the EU advocates for Ukraine's interests. We have to move it we have to change, the sequence. The horse, which is Ukraine leadership, has to be the first, and then the European partners, if they see progress with anti-corruption reforms and all other reforms that Ukraine promised to do, and unfortunately has not delivered much, then the carrot and the horse will move together in one direction, which is Europe.
Yeah, I will say just a few words. First of all, you should not forget one thing that after Maidan you achieved really quite a lot. Of course, still things are, areas where things should be improved, like anti-corruption and so on. But what you managed to do, like energy reforms, country becoming independent from Gazprom, gas, price liberalization in energy field, fiscal consolidation, deficit going down, and now also, decisions on pension reform, healthcare reform, education reform, despite all the problems with all those reforms, but those are really big things, which you need to see that they were done. So Ukraine is not such a lost case, first of all. Second, really, is you need to learn how to manage your expectations. For example, fight against corruption, again, needs time and needs not only institutions who are fighting against corruption. Prevention of the corruption is also very important. And like better regulation of business, like moving with doing business, indexes, abandoning too much of bureaucracy, in different, business areas. That's again what is changing, environment for corruption. And the last point, when the stick is really working, how to create, big stick. Big stick is working, at least my understanding is very simple. One really, as wide as possible, society is really understanding what they can get, what they can achieve. And that was, with the free, that was with association agreement and so on and so on. So that is why we're proposing Marshall Plan, because we think that exactly, if there is no membership perspective at the moment, but Marshall Plan, with all that, symbolism, with the language, with the, clear understanding that the money can come and can, build better roads and something like that, it can create in the society, expectations that it can be done if the government will push the reforms. Because money will come if the reforms are done. But, but that's why, again, we need to have this, as broad as possible, understanding that really it's very much needed. That's why we put this Marshall Plan with very clear logic and clear symbolism to create in Ukrainian society this wish to move forward with such an instrument and to do the reforms which are needed to have this Marshall Plan, and with its money.
Thank you for your remarks. Thanks everyone for coming today for the Free Russia House for our discussion. Olenay Trigub, Екатериной Смаглий, Mr. Andres Kubilüs. I hope next time we're going to be in these walls already during with implement of Marshall Plan for Ukraine, sure, and thinking about the Marshall Plans for Free Russia.
Good. Okay, we shall go.